U417.
By Sven Hansen.
Chapter 1. The Phantom in the Depths.
In the shadowed depths of the North Atlantic, where the sun's light was but a distant memory, and pressure and cold reigned supreme, U417 glided silently through the ink-dark waters. The submarine, a sleek metal leviathan, seemed less like a man-made vessel and more like a creature of myth, an elusive predator, born of steel and steam, that haunted the corridors of Allied shipping routes like a whisper of death. Captain Wilhelm Schaefer stood tall in the conning tower, his gloved hands gripping the cold rail as condensation curled from his breath. He was a man carved from discipline, with silver-shot hair that betrayed the stress of too many missions and eyes the color of Arctic ice, calculating, distant, and always watchful. Around him, the heartbeat of the U-boat pulsed, the muted hum of turbines, the rhythmic exhale of the oxygen scrubbers, the occasional bark of orders exchanged in clipped, precise German. Schaefer's command had become legend among Allied forces. U417 was spoken of in tense whispers across naval bases, nicknamed the Phantom of the Deep for its uncanny ability to appear, strike, and vanish without a trace. Ships were lost under clear skies. Convoys disappeared between check-ins. To some, it felt like the ocean itself was waging war. But U417's success wasn't merely mechanical. It wasn't radar-defying technology or sheer brute force that kept it safe. It was Schaefer's mind, a chess master's mind, and the brilliant deception of its hidden lair, a secret sea cave beneath the rugged cliffs of the Isle of Man. Nestled between Great Britain and Ireland, the Isle remained largely untouched by war, its pastoral silence a veil that masked the spectral war machine lying dormant beneath. The entrance to the cave was a marvel of nature and luck, a narrow fissure in the cliff face, almost invisible from the air or sea. At high tide, the entrance vanished beneath the waves entirely. But Schaefer knew the timing. He knew the tides. It was as though the sea itself had extended him an invitation. Inside, the cave widened into a cathedral-like chamber, its stone walls slick with condensation. Seabirds nested in the shadows above, and salt-laden air echoed with the distant crash of waves. Here, U417 could refit, repair, and regroup in perfect secrecy. It was both womb and tomb, a sanctuary that could easily become a trap if betrayed. Schaefer descended into the control room, where banks of gauges and brass dials glowed under dim red lighting. His officers straightened instinctively as he passed, each man knowing the weight their captain carried. He was more than a commander. He was myth and morale, the thread keeping their sanity intact in the claustrophobic metal shell. Kameraden, we've received new orders. Disrupt the supply lines to the East Coast. Our objective is disruption, not slaughter. But above all, we remain unseen. Ghosts of the deep. The sea is our cloak, the silence our shield. We return here only if our movements remain undetected. No errors, no assumptions. The room held its breath. Then, one by one, the men nodded. Grim, weathered faces bore silent agreement. These were not boys. They were sailors of war, tempered by cold and pressure, and they understood what it meant to disappear. Later, alone in his quarters, Schaefer removed a photograph from a hidden compartment, a young boy grinning beside a piano and a woman with sorrowful eyes. He touched it briefly before tucking it back away. This war had made him many things: a killer, a strategist, a ghost, but not heartless. Never that. And so U417 returned to the black waters, its engines purring low, its hull hugging the sea floor, sliding unseen toward its prey. Above, the surface shimmered with sunlight and calm. Below, the Phantom moved as it always had, unseen, unfelt, unknown.
Chapter 2. The Discovery.
Unbeknownst to her, as she stared out over the waves, still catching her breath, her frantic escape had not gone unnoticed. Deep beneath the waves, a ripple disturbed the surface near the cave mouth, minor, barely visible. But inside the steel shell of U417, it was enough. Inside the submarine, alarm bells didn't ring. There was no panic, just a subtle tightening of the atmosphere. Schaefer sat at the communication station, reviewing decoded orders, when his first mate approached, his expression taut. Something disturbed the exterior, he said. A brief flicker in the pressure sensors. Possibly marine life, but possibly not. Schaefer didn't blink. Double watches on all entry points. From now on, no surface activity during daylight. The cave must remain unseen. And in that moment, the illusion of perfect invisibility, the cloak that had protected them for months, began to unravel.
Chapter 3. Torn Allegiances.
Isla sat on the crest of the cliff that evening, her wet gear drying beside her in the fading sunlight. The wind tugged gently at the loose strands of her hair, and the distant bleating of sheep drifted up from the pasture below. But her mind was a world away, deep beneath the waves, in a cavern where war slumbered in the shape of steel and secrets. She had seen the men, just glimpses, shadows, uniforms, movement. But they were real, alive. She didn't know how long the submarine had been there, how many missions it had carried out, or what destruction it had already unleashed. But the implications chilled her. The war, so far a distant drumbeat of newspaper headlines and ration coupons, had just crept onto her shores. Still, Isla didn't tell anyone. It wasn't an act of betrayal, she told herself. Not yet. It was caution, a choice to gather more information before she sounded the alarm, to understand what she had found. Who she had found. These weren't faceless enemies, they were men, engineers, officers, human beings, not monsters. And besides, if she told the authorities now, what would happen? They might not believe her, or worse, they might act without understanding. Send depth charges into the cove, risk war erupting on her island's peaceful doorstep. No, not yet. That night, she began a journal. A small, leather-bound book, tucked beneath the floorboard in her room. Each page detailed her observations, the patterns of tides, the suspected schedule of the submarine's movement, the time of day the gulls scattered from the cliffs. She even attempted sketches of the vessel, committing every detail she could recall to paper. She would be vigilant, watchful, and when the moment was right, when she knew enough, she would act.
Below, within the echoing confines of U417, the atmosphere had shifted. Captain Schaefer stood alone in the submarine's control room, lit dimly by red nightlights. The metallic scent of the sea mingled with engine oil and sweat. It was a scent he had grown used to, even comforted by, but now it seemed cloying. Off. The report from his first mate was still fresh in his mind. Unconfirmed disturbance near the cave's entrance. Possibly nothing. Possibly everything. He didn't believe in luck, not anymore. Luck was what sank good men. Caution, vigilance, these were his creeds. Send out 2 divers, he said quietly. I want the perimeter checked, full sweep, entry point, ceiling, floor. If there's damage or evidence of intrusion, I want it reported immediately. His first mate blinked. Sir, wouldn't it be safer to stay hidden? Movement could increase risk. Schaefer cut him off with a glance. Secrecy means nothing if we've already been seen. Moments later, the divers slipped into the black water, their bodies swallowed by the cave's gloom. Schaefer watched from the forward viewing port, eyes narrowed. He didn't know what they would find, but he trusted instinct. Someone had brushed against their sanctuary. The illusion of invincibility was cracking, and once cracks began, they spread fast.
On land, Isla returned again and again to the cliffs, each visit a deeper descent into her own obsession. She kept a distance, always watching from above, always staying hidden. But inside, her resolve warred with fear. These men had names, families, faces, yet their presence here was still a threat. And the longer she watched, the more she felt trapped between 2 worlds, neither fully on their side, nor fully on her own. What would her father say if he were still alive? A fisherman who had believed in honor, but also mercy. Would he have told the authorities immediately? Or would he have waited, as she now did, caught between duty and empathy? The answer never came. Only the wind and the sea whispering secrets she couldn't quite understand.
Chapter 4. The Dance of Shadows.
The Isle of Man was a place where secrets could lie undisturbed for centuries. Hidden valleys cradled ancient stones older than the churches, and the sea had always kept its own counsel. But the quiet was shifting, like a hush before a storm. And Isla McLeod, farm girl, diver, now unwitting spy, was dancing dangerously close to the edge. Obsessed, she found herself returning to the cliffs day after day, her gaze fixed on the water where U417 lay hidden beneath its cloak of waves. Her thoughts turned incessantly over what she had seen, what she hadn't yet understood, and what she feared might come to pass. In her mind, she replayed the moment she had stumbled across the submarine, the shock, the disbelief, the thrill of discovery tinged with dread.
It had been 9 days since her discovery of the submarine. Each morning she returned to the cliffs with her binoculars, her journal tucked in her satchel. The cove was still. The gulls returned, but the tension in her gut told her otherwise.
She began diving more frequently, each time creeping closer to the cave's mouth. She never entered. Not fully, only far enough to confirm the submarine was still there. The torchlight would skim across the hull, sometimes catching movement, figures at work, a glimpse of machinery, flashes of uniforms. It was terrifying and thrilling. She sketched everything, the direction of shadows, the arrangement of equipment, even the symbols she didn't recognize. The cave had become a second world to her, one of danger and strange intimacy. She watched them without being seen, or so she believed.
Inside U417, Schaefer reviewed the diver's findings with growing unease. There were boot prints, the diver reported, not ours, on the rock shelf near the cave entrance. Recent. Schaefer didn't respond immediately. He traced a finger across the metal map mounted in the control room, outlining their escape route, just in case. If someone knows we're here, he said at last, they haven't told the British yet, but they will. He dispatched another patrol that evening, not into the sea, but onto land. 2 of his men, fluent in English, disguised in civilian garb, were sent out under cover of night to observe the village. Their task: listen, watch, determine if suspicion had begun to bloom among the locals.
It had. 3 days earlier, a British patrol vessel passing near the island's western coast had picked up a faint anomaly on sonar. Not enough to warrant immediate action, but enough to be logged. Possibly a submerged wreck, the report read. Unusual cavity in the cliff wall, potential signs of human activity. The information worked its way up the chain slowly, too slowly, perhaps. But soon enough, it reached someone with a memory of stories, of lost ships and unsolved sinkings attributed to a phantom U-boat. Someone who began to ask questions. A surveillance aircraft was authorized.
Isla didn't know about the aircraft, but she did notice something strange near the cliff path one afternoon. A man she'd never seen before, watching the sea through a pair of binoculars. His clothes were ordinary but too new. His shoes clean, unscuffed, didn't belong to a farmhand. She passed him slowly, pretending to adjust her pack. He didn't look at her, but he shifted slightly, just enough to shield his notebook from her view. That night she couldn't sleep. Something was happening. The veil was thinning, and for the first time she felt caught between 2 forces larger than herself. One below, unseen and silent. One above, methodical and relentless. By the end of the week, she made her boldest move yet. Just before dawn, she swam into the cave, not to observe from the edge, but to enter, fully flashlight in hand. The submarine loomed before her like a sleeping beast. She surfaced in the pocket of air near the rock shelf, heart thundering. She wasn't alone.
A figure stepped out from the shadows, young, lean, in uniform. They locked eyes. He didn't speak, but he didn't raise an alarm either.
And Isla, for reasons she couldn't name, raised a hand in slow greeting.
He stared for a beat, then nodded once, before disappearing into the submarine. Chapter 5. The Encounter. The clouds hung low and heavy over the Isle of Man, as if the sky itself had grown suspicious. Rain drifted down in intermittent curtains, slicking the stone paths and seeping into the earth. The sea, once calm, had turned sullen and choppy, its waves capped with white, its rhythm unsettled.
Isla sat by the fireplace that morning, staring into the flicker of flames while her tea cooled untouched in her hands. Her father's old radio crackled in the background, a BBC voice recounting the latest Allied advancements in Europe, but she wasn't listening. She had been seen. The man in the cave, the crewman, hadn't raised the alarm, but he had seen her. And if he spoke to his captain, if orders changed, if the Germans grew more aggressive or desperate, then her window of watchfulness would close. This delicate balance, her secret vigil, was nearing collapse. But the truth was, she didn't know what she wanted to happen next. Not really.
Miles away, the crew of U417 sat hunched over depth charts in tense silence. British sonar sweep near the northern cove, Schaefer said grimly, tapping the map. They're getting curious. This is no coincidence. His officers exchanged glances. The patrol vessel from earlier in the week had returned, this time slower, more deliberate, its instruments active. Schaefer had heard the pings echo through the water like a heartbeat. They know something's here, he muttered, or they suspect enough to start poking. They couldn't risk surfacing until nightfall. Even then, every second above the waves increased the chance of exposure. But their fuel cells needed oxygen replenishment soon, and a radio update to command in France was overdue. His jaw tightened. Everything was unraveling at once. He hadn't yet spoken of the girl. The crewman who saw her had reported the sighting in private, quiet and unsure. She didn't run, he'd said. She didn't look afraid. Schaefer had said nothing in reply. But in truth, the report unsettled him more than the sonar sweeps. The sea he could anticipate. But the girl, she was a variable, a dangerous one.
On the cliffs, Isla saw the patrol boat first. It came from the southwest, moving slowly, clearly mapping the seabed. Men stood on deck with binoculars and signal flags, scanning the coastline. From her vantage point behind a gorse bush, Isla could see one of them point toward the cliffs. Not directly at the cave, but close enough to make her stomach turn. The boat lingered. Then, as if satisfied or perhaps cautious, it turned away and disappeared into the mist. But the damage was done. The net was tightening.
That evening, Schaefer gathered his officers in the control room. The air was thick with tension and sweat, condensation trickling down the walls. Outside, the sea roared against the cave like an angry animal. Reported us already. Our only advantage now is that we haven't been caught. His eyes swept the room. We strike tonight, one last mission. We cripple the convoy expected near the Irish Sea. Then we return to France. No more hiding. There were no objections, only nods. The ghost would strike once more before it vanished.
Unaware of the decision beneath the sea, Isla stood again at the cliff's edge, her binoculars trained on the horizon. Her journal was heavy in her satchel, now filled with more than just observations, maps, timings, movements. But doubt crept in like a cold wind. How long could she wait? What would her silence cost? And what would happen if her presence in the cave reached the wrong ears?
Chapter 6, The Fallen Dragon. The sun was nowhere to be found when U417 slipped silently from its cave, its steel body slicing through the dark water like a blade. Above, the surface was a churning black mirror, flecked with cold rain. Lightning flashed distantly to the west, illuminating the cliffs in pale flickers.
Inside the submarine, the mood was tight, silent, focused. Schaefer moved through the control room with calm precision, issuing orders in short bursts. Engines holding steady. Maintain course to target coordinates. Silent running, all compartments secure. The mission was clear. Intercept and cripple a heavily protected Allied convoy en route from Liverpool to the French coast. One more surgical strike, one more message to the enemy that the sea still belonged to ghosts. But 30 minutes into their course, the hum of the engines shifted, barely perceptible at first. A vibration. Report, Schaefer said sharply. A junior engineer's voice cracked through the intercom. Main ballast pumps are showing pressure loss. Starboard propulsion slowing. Schaefer's heart sank, switched to reserve. Already did, sir. They're not responding. It wasn't a fatal failure, yet. But the implications were clear. U417 couldn't run silent with a damaged engine. It couldn't outrun destroyers. And if they engaged in combat under these conditions, they would be cornered. He stood still for a long moment, eyes closed. Abort the mission, return to the cave, begin repairs immediately. It was not said lightly, and no one argued. The submarine turned, limping through the dark like a wounded predator, back to the only shelter it had left.
On land, Isla stood soaked in the fading rain, outside a modest stone cottage nestled among the fields. The windows glowed dimly with lantern light. Her nerves were coiled tight as violin strings. She knocked.
The door opened to reveal Thomas "Tom" McAllister, older than Isla by 4 years, with a weathered face and eyes too kind to belong to someone who'd fought in France. He had returned to the island to recover from a shrapnel injury and now worked part-time as a mechanic and part-time as an unpaid village helper.
"I need to talk," she said, stepping past him into the warm, cramped kitchen. She told him everything. Not all at once, not clearly, but enough. The cave, the submarine, the men, the notebook filled with sketches and times. Her fear, her hesitation, her need to understand before she decided what to do.
Tom sat silently the whole time, nodding occasionally, brow furrowed. When she finished, he didn't speak right away. He took the kettle off the stove, poured 2 mugs of tea, and slid one to her.
"Do you think they'll kill you if they find out you've been watching?" he asked.
Isla blinked. I don't know.
"And do you think the Brits will care much about why you waited to tell them?"
Silent.
Tom exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "This is a mess, but you did the right thing coming here."
She nodded, but her stomach didn't believe it.
Tom leaned in. "You're not alone, Isla, but we've got to be smart and careful. If that sub leaves again, or if they're planning something big, we need to act." Quietly, fast, and on our own terms.
He looked at her, eyes earnest. You're not a traitor, but you are sitting on a powder keg. Back in the cave, U417 returned, wounded and quiet. The crew moved with grim efficiency. The starboard propulsion system was worse than feared. Several key seals had worn through, and salt water had crept into the lower engine compartment. Repairs would take days, possibly longer. Schaefer ran a hand over his weary face. They were trapped, and he knew now, with chilling certainty, that time was no longer on their side. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The rain had cleared by morning, but the air remained thick, heavy with the scent of salt and sodden earth. Tom McAllister stood at the edge of a sheep paddock, arms crossed, scanning the distant cliff path through a pair of old military field glasses. He didn't tell Isla what he planned to do. She'd already placed her trust in him once. He didn't want to make her question that decision, but his gut told him time was running out. He walked 2 miles inland to a small communications shack used during the war to monitor emergency radio signals. It hadn't been manned in over a year, but the radio inside still worked. Tom had kept it functional, mostly out of habit and stubbornness. He tuned it slowly, carefully, and transmitted a message on a coded British naval frequency he remembered from his time in France.
Isle of Man, Western Cliffs, possible U-boat, undercover, cavern formation, request discreet recon, no engagement, civilian presence nearby.
He signed it with a field ID known to a single former intelligence contact, still embedded on the mainland. Then he left, quietly, like he'd never been there. At the cave, tension was spreading like oil through water. Repairs were slow. Replacement parts for the engine were scarce, and some components needed to be remachined by hand. The torpedo systems were still operational, but without propulsion, they were sitting ducks. Morale was slipping, and Schaefer could feel it. He wasn't imagining them. At mess that evening, he found his second-in-command, Oberleutnant Karl Weber, sitting alone, staring at his untouched meal.
Karl, Schaefer said, setting down his tin cup across from him.
Weber didn't look up. I read the damage report again. We're weeks from full restoration.
Schaefer nodded. We may not need full restoration. Just enough to move, enough to escape.
Weber's eyes narrowed. And go where, Wilhelm? France? Germany? They may not even be standing by the time we get there. You've seen the tide of the war.
I have, Schaefer said evenly.
Then Weber leaned in, voice low. We're not ghosts anymore. We're a shadow cornered. Every day we stay here, we become a story waiting to end. Maybe it's time to scuttle the boat, take to land, surrender if it comes to that. Schaefer's jaw tensed. Are you giving up? I'm giving you options. They held each other's gaze for a long moment, old respect strained by fresh fear.
Elsewhere, Ayla wandered the cliffs, her journal weighing like a stone in her bag. She hadn't seen Tom all day. That wasn't unusual, but it felt unusual. Her nerves were too raw now to ignore small shifts. She wondered if she should tell someone, not everyone, just a person who could really act. But who? Then at dusk, she saw movement along the shore below, the faint flicker of a signal light. Someone in a boat too far out to be a fisherman. She crouched low, heart thudding. Something had shifted. Again, she was no longer the only one watching.
Chapter 8. A Convergence of Worlds.
Night descended with purpose, wrapping the cliffs in a cloak of wind and silence. The tide was high, waves rushing into rocky inlets with muffled thunder. Stars blinked between drifting clouds, indifferent to the plans of men and women poised on the edge of something irreversible.
Isla moved with care, descending toward the cove with a waterproof pack slung across her back. She wore dark clothes and carried no light. Her boots found familiar footholds on the cliffside, her body attuned to every crack in the stone. She knew this path by heart now, the way it curved and narrowed, the scent of kelp and iron in the air. But tonight was different. She was no longer sneaking to something, she was going into it.
In the cave, U417 pulsed with subdued activity. Repairs continued in hushed tones. The crew was tired, tense. Some whispered of mutiny, not in action, but in spirit. A sort of passive unraveling, waiting for someone else to make the next hard choice.
Schaefer stood alone on the small rock outcropping just inside the entrance, his preferred spot when he needed air that didn't taste like diesel. He listened to the sea, trying to decode what it was telling him.
He didn't hear Isla approach. She surfaced silently, pulled herself up onto the wet rocks, and stood behind him. Water streamed down her arms and legs. but her eyes were steady.
Schaeffer turned only when he sensed her presence.
For a long moment, neither spoke.
You know I've seen you, she said, breathless from the climb and the current. I've watched you. I know what this is.
He didn't move. Why are you here?
To ask the same of you, she replied.
Silence stretched again, thick as the cave air. Then Schaeffer gestured for her to step out of the cold spray. She hesitated, then followed him toward the interior, where soft red light glowed faintly from the control room hatch. She didn't enter. Neither did he.
You are the girl my crewman saw, he said at last.
I am?
And you haven't reported us.
Not yet, she said.
His brows twitched. A flicker of something passed through his expression. Not surprise, maybe. Respect?
You could have brought the British days ago.
I might still, she said. But I wanted to know what kind of men you are.
He studied her. And what have you decided?
Isla hesitated. I don't know. You're soldiers, but so are the men on the ships you've sunk.
His gaze drifted toward the submarine's dim silhouette. I know.
She frowned. You do feel it, the weight.
But duty?
Duty isn't enough anymore, she snapped. This isn't duty. This is hiding. You're not fighting a war. You're surviving a myth you built.
That landed like a slap. His face hardened. And what would you have me do? Surrender? Ask mercy from a war machine that gives none?
I would have you stop before it's too late.
Her voice trembled then, not with fear, but with the gravity of her words. There's a boat out there. British. Watching. They're circling, slow and patient. They know something's wrong. You won't get another mission. Not from here.
He didn't answer right away. Then why tell me this?
Because I see more than a uniform, she said. And I want to believe there's a man in there who doesn't want to die in a steel coffin.
The words hung between them like fog, dense and close. Then Schaeffer did something unexpected. He bowed his head just slightly. Thank you.
She didn't know what to say.
Ela backed away slowly, uncertain what had shifted, but knowing something had.
Then she disappeared into the sea once more.
And Schaeffer was left with a truth he could no longer unhear. Chapter 9, Choices and Consequences.
The cave was quiet after Isla's departure. The water had calmed, the sea's pulse softened. But inside U417, something had shifted. Not in sound or movement, but in intent.
Captain Schaeffer sat alone in the radio room, staring at a coded sheet of paper that he did not reach for. He could have sent a message, could have called in another mission, could have asked for extraction or orders or anything, but he didn't. Instead, he opened a worn notebook tucked behind a ventilation panel. Inside were hand-drawn sketches, his daughter's crayon lines from a letter long since lost, copied by memory, and an old photo, creased and fading, of a woman smiling in summer light. He turned to a blank page and began writing.
Not a report, a letter.
He didn't tell the crew, not yet. The engine team continued repairs with mechanical focus, unaware that their captain was quietly planning for surrender. He calculated everything: how long they could stay hidden, how many days of air and rations remained, how to position the sub without appearing hostile. It had to be perfect, clean, not just survival, but a choice to lay down arms. But Schaeffer also knew the risks. Not everyone aboard would agree. Loyalty ran deep, but pride ran deeper.
On land, Isla climbed the hill to Tom's cottage just past dawn, her clothes still damp from the night's dive.
He opened the door before she knocked, his eyes wide with concern. "You're soaked. Again."
I saw him, she said, stepping inside. Schaeffer.
Tom's face hardened. "He let you live."
He listened. She dropped her pack onto the kitchen table and pulled out her journal. He's going to surrender. I felt it.
Tom looked skeptical, but not dismissive. "That's a hell of a thing to bet your life on."
I'm not betting anything, Ela snapped. I'm giving him a chance. One chance. But if I'm wrong, I'll report it myself.
He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, processing. "Then we need a backup plan," he said.
Already have one. She handed him a sealed envelope. If I don't come back after my next visit to the cave, take this to the Coast Guard. It's everything. Times, sketches, locations, names. They'll believe you.
Tom didn't like it. She could see it in the pinch of his brow, the way he tapped his fingers against the mug on the counter. But he nodded. "I'll hold it, but I hope I never have to open it." In the following days, Schaeffer began laying groundwork. He altered the watch schedule, allowing more rest. He distributed rations evenly, without delay. And when he gathered the senior crew under the pretense of reviewing navigation routes, he casually mentioned possible exit scenarios that didn't involve engagement. He watched their reactions closely. Weber was quiet.
Others nodded slowly, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. No one resisted yet, but the first seeds were planted, not of mutiny, but of acceptance. Chapter 10, A Final Gambit. U417 sat cloaked in the cold belly of the sea cave, its lights dimmed to preserve power, its crew unaware that their sanctuary had become a trap, tightening with every tide. Most of the men worked in weary silence, resigned to the rhythm of waiting. But below the surface, cracks were forming. The subtle softening, the way orders had shifted from prepare to strike to preserve the vessel. And when he'd overheard Schaffer speaking quietly to Weber, words like negotiation and possibility of surrender, something twisted in his gut.
He had lost a brother in the early days of the war and a cousin to a British air raid. For Matthias, this war wasn't strategy, it was revenge. It was identity.
That night, while the crew slept in turns, he crept into the narrow auxiliary room where the emergency transmitter was stored, meant for use if the main communications array failed.
And he hesitated.
He could signal Berlin, report the captain's intent to defect. He even knew the proper codes.
But part of him held back, not from fear, but from doubt.
Would they believe me? Would they care?
He didn't send the message. Not yet.
But he tucked the coded sheet into his boot and returned to his bunk, the decision not fully made, but growing. Above, the sky had cleared, moonlight glazed the cliffs in silver, and just offshore a dark, silent shape glided slowly across the water. A British torpedo boat, armed and cautious.
On board, Lieutenant Gerald Hale peered through a pair of field glasses at the shoreline. "This is the third night we've seen activity here," he muttered. The technician beside him nodded. "Coded transmission received last week. A source named McLeod said a U-boat was hiding near these cliffs." Hale asked. He studied the land again. "No sudden moves. We don't provoke anything unless we're certain. But if it is a U-boat, sir, then we wait for dawn."
On land, Isla stood on the cliff path, her feet half frozen in the dew. She'd seen the patrol boat, had watched its silhouette circle like a shark in the fog. She carried a flare gun in her satchel now, something Tom had insisted on. If things go bad, he'd said, you signal, someone will see it, I'll see it. Tonight might be the night. She descended into the cove for what she believed would be the final time.
In the cave, Schaefer stood in the control room, the soft red lights flickering over his worn face. He held the surrender draft in his hands, a message written in precise English, identifying U417, its crew, and the terms of peaceful surrender. No tricks, no conditions, just survival. He handed it to Weber. "Prepare the crew, quietly, no panic. We surface tomorrow night. Full lights, we will be seen." Weber nodded.
But Matthias, who had been silently wiping down the inner bulkhead, caught the word surrender.
And this time, he didn't hesitate. Chapter 11, Emergence.
The hour before dawn was always the coldest. Inside U417, tension coiled in the pipes and panels like steam under pressure. Schaffer moved with purpose, checking final systems, his surrender message sealed in a waterproof container. Weber prepared the crew for surfacing quietly without drama. No uniforms, no weapons, no resistance. But elsewhere in the hull, sabotage brewed. He bypassed the crew quarters, made his way to the aft section where torpedo systems were housed. There, beneath layers of insulation and locked compartments, sat a manual override, an emergency activation port.
He didn't need full control.
Just one working torpedo.
One gesture of defiance.
One act that would ensure the war remained a war, not a negotiated end.
He was halfway through disengaging the safety lock when a voice echoed from the forward passage. "Muss." It was Weber. "You don't need to do this," the officer said, stepping into view, not armed but tense. "She's poisoned him," Matthias snapped. "That girl, the one who comes from the sea. He's going to surrender us like traitors."
"He's trying to save us," Weber said calmly. "This boat can't run. If we're found resisting, we all die. You think Berlin will send a rescue?"
Matthias's hands trembled. He looked down at the partially disengaged lock. "She spoke to him," he hissed. "No one speaks to the enemy, not if they still believe."
"We're not soldiers anymore," Weber said. "We're survivors, and you'll kill every one of us if you do this."
Matthias hesitated, then turned.
And ran.
Meanwhile, Isla swam into the cove before the sun cracked the sky, her breath ragged from the cold and tension. She reached the cave's interior just as warning klaxons began to blare. Lights flickered, a thud reverberated through the steel hull. Then voices. Shouts in German, boots slamming metal, commands barked over the intercom. She ducked behind a rock shelf, heart pounding. Something had gone wrong.
Then Sheffer appeared, storming down the gangway, fury and panic written across his face. He passed her hiding spot, unaware of her presence, moving fast.
Moments later, Matthias barreled into the engine compartment, trying to override the auto-lock doors. Weber was close behind.
"Step back," Weber shouted. "That's an order!"
Matthias turned, wild-eyed. "You're gonna let her win. You'll hand us over to the British. You think they'll spare us?"
Schaffer arrived just in time to hear the last word. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "We are not surrendering to her," he said. "We are surrendering to peace, because the sea has taken enough."
Matthias looked at them both, breath ragged. Then he reached for the manual trigger.
Weber moved, fast, too fast to think. The two men collided, the emergency panel slamming shut with a hiss. The torpedo never launched, but the fight had begun.
From her hidden vantage, Ela could see it unraveling, the chaos, the desperation. She made a decision. She scrambled forward into full view, hands raised. "Stop."
Her voice rang across the steel. The men froze.
Schaefer turned to her slowly, breathless. Matthias looked at her as if she were a ghost.
"I don't want this to end in blood," Ela said, stepping forward. "I told you they're watching. A patrol boat's offshore. They'll destroy you if you surface without a sign." She reached into her satchel. "I have one. The flare gun."
"One chance," Schaffer nodded slowly. "Light it." Ela fired. The flare arced skyward from the mouth of the cave, bright crimson against the pale horizon. A signal of surrender, a plea for mercy, a gamble. Chapter 12, Beyond the Waves. The flare rose like a crimson comet, arsing into the dawn sky. "He's trying to save us,"
Weber said calmly. "This boat can't run. If we're found resisting, we all die. You think Berlin will send a rescue?" Matthias's hands trembled. He looked down at the partially disengaged lock. She spoke to him. He hissed. "No one speaks to the enemy, not if they still believe." "We're not soldiers anymore," Weber said. "We're survivors, and you'll kill every one of us if you do this." Matthias hesitated, then turned.
Meanwhile, Ela swam into the cove before the sun cracked the sky, her breath ragged from the cold and tension. She reached the cave's interior just as warning klaxons began to blare. Lights flickered. A thud reverberated through the steel hull. Then voices, shouts in German, boots slamming metal, commands barked over the intercom. She ducked behind a rock shelf, heart pounding. Something had gone wrong.
Then Scheffer appeared, storming down the gangway, fury and panic written across his face. He passed her hiding spot, unaware of her presence, moving fast.
Moments later, Matthias barreled into the engine compartment, trying to override the auto-lock doors. Weber was close behind. "Step back," Weber shouted. "That's an order!" Matthias turned, wild-eyed. "You're gonna let her win. You'll hand us over to the British. You think they'll spare us?" Schaefer arrived just in time to hear the last word. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "We are not surrendering to her," he said. "We are surrendering to peace, because the sea has taken enough." Matthias looked at them both, breath ragged. Then he reached for the manual trigger. Weber moved.
Too fast to think. The two men collided, the emergency panel slamming shut with a hiss. The torpedo never launched, but the fight had begun.
From her hidden vantage, Ela could see it unraveling, the chaos, the desperation. She made a decision. She scrambled forward into full view, hands raised. "Stop."
Her voice rang across the steel. The men froze.
Schaefer turned to her slowly, breathless. Matthias looked at her as if she were a ghost.
"I don't want this to end in blood," Ela said, stepping forward. "I told you, they're watching. Patrol boats offshore, they'll destroy you if you surface without a sign." She reached into her satchel. "I have one, the flare gun."
"One chance."
Schaefer nodded slowly. "Light it."
Ela fired. The flare arced skyward from the mouth of the cave, bright crimson against the pale horizon. A signal of surrender, a plea for mercy, a gamble. Chapter 12, Beyond the Waves. The flare rose like a crimson comet, arcing into the dawn sky.
On board the British patrol boat, Lieutenant Gerald Hale leaned forward, eyes narrowed. The crew around him went still. "Signal flare, sir," the lookout said, from the cliff cove. "Definitely red. Means distress," Hale muttered, "or surrender." He hesitated only a second longer before barking. "Stations, prepare to approach. No sudden fire unless fired upon. But be ready."
The engines hummed to life, turning the boat toward the cliffs with steady urgency. Inside the cave, the crew of U417 waited in stunned silence.
The flare had gone up, the countdown had begun. Matthias sat on the floor, restrained but conscious. His lip was split, and his right eye had already begun to swell shut. But his eyes never left Schaefer, burning with defiance, shame, and grief all at once. "You should have let me die," he muttered. Schaefer crouched in front of him. "You wanted to die for a cause that doesn't know your name. I want you to live for something better." Matthias scoffed, but something in his eyes wavered. Then Weber entered. Contact made, the patrol boats signaling. They're demanding surrender confirmation before boarding. "Are they armed?" Schaefer asked. "Fully." Schaefer stood. "Then we go slow, careful. We give them everything. No lies, no pride, just truth."
The U-boat's hatch opened to morning light for the first time in weeks. One by one, the crew emerged, hands raised, jackets off, stepping barefoot onto the wet rock ledge just inside the cove. The British arrived minutes later, weapons drawn.
Hands high, a soldier barked. No sudden movements. Schaefer stepped forward, holding the waterproof tube above his head. "I am Kapitänleutnant Wilhelm Schaefer," he said clearly. "This is a voluntary surrender. No resistance, no weapons. We seek safe detainment for our crew." Hale moved forward, pistol raised. He took the tube, eyes never leaving Schaefer's. He read the message inside, then looked up. "God help me," he muttered. "You're telling the truth." Schaefer nodded once. "Get them processed," Hale ordered, "one at a time. Secure the submarine, no explosives, no surprises." "No surprises left," Schaefer said quietly.
By noon, the beach below the cliffs was lined with figures. Germans seated under guard, British sailors taking inventory, Isle of Man officials arriving in wool coats and disbelief.
Trembled, but not from the cold. "They're alive," she said, voice small.
Tom nodded beside her.
She didn't answer, just watched as Schaefer was led toward a waiting vehicle, his hands bound, his shoulders straight.
He turned once, just enough to meet her eyes. A nod of thanks, of farewell.
Back in the cave, Matthias remained silent. The others had turned their backs, not cruelly, just turned. It was Weber who finally approached. "We'll be prisoners now," he said. "I know, better than being ghosts." Matthias said nothing.
But when they let him out, he didn't resist. Chapter 13, Epilogue, Beneath the Surface. The Isle of Man never quite returned to what it had been. The surrender of U417 rippled through the community like a submerged quake, unseen at first, but slowly reshaping the landscape. Some villagers were proud, whispering tales of bravery and cleverness over pints at the pub. Others were wary, viewing Isla Macleod with eyes sharpened by suspicion. She had hidden something dangerous. She had waited.
Tom stayed by her side, unshaken. "They don't have to understand," he said. "You didn't do it for them."
And maybe that was true. Didn't quite know who she'd done it for anymore. The men? Schaefer? Herself?
All of it, and none of it.
The crew of U417 were transferred to a naval detainment facility in England. They were interrogated, photographed, assigned numbers. But no one resisted. They followed orders with a grim kind of grace, like men who had already said their goodbyes.
Matthias was kept under watch for the first few weeks. He didn't speak. Then slowly he began to write, scraps of thoughts in German, fragments of memory, names of ships, faces of crewmates. He never apologized, but he never denied what he'd tried to do. One day, Weber found him sitting by a barred window, watching a storm gather in the sky. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Matthias didn't look away. "I regret not understanding sooner."
As for Schaefer, his fate was quieter. He was separated from his men, questioned by higher ranks, not accused, not condemned, simply held. His name never made headlines. There were too many names by then, too many wars within the war.
He spent his time translating poetry into English. When asked why, he said, "Because language is the last thing we have that doesn't need a flag."
He never saw Isla again.
But her name, he wrote once in a notebook no one was meant to find.
Isla, not enemy, not savior, just witness. Years later, long after the war had receded into textbooks and television specials, a small museum opened on the island. Inside was a single, unassuming exhibit, the submarine in the cave. Visitors could read the journal of a young woman who watched from the cliffs, see the sketches she drew, the flare gun she fired, a photograph of the surrender, the crew emerging into light. No politics, no glory, just people. And the ocean that once held their secrets.
For Ela, the sea never returned to silence. She still walked the cliffs, still listened to the waves. Some days she thought she heard the hum of a submarine engine far below. Other days it was only memory, but always, beneath the surface, something remained. Not guilt, not pride, just the truth, and the weight of having seen it.
Epilogue, the message in the glass. 30 years later, summer 1975. The museum was quiet that afternoon. A soft rain tapped against the high windows, and the sea beyond was calm, its surface broken only by the occasional fishing boat.
Isla McLeod moved slowly now, her gait tempered by time, her braids streaked with silver. She had not visited the museum in over a decade. Too many memories had been placed behind glass, too many voices reduced to typed captions. But today, something called her back.
She stood in front of the U417 exhibit, eyes scanning the familiar items, her journal carefully preserved. A torn page of Schaeffer's letter, donated anonymously, the flare gun, unfired now, but still heavy with memory.
A new addition caught her eye, a sealed bottle inside a small glass-topped case. The note within had been carefully unrolled, preserved under museum-grade plastic.
It was signed Wilhelm Schaeffer. No one knew how it had arrived. A fisherman had pulled it from a net years ago and handed it to a mainland historian. It took decades to verify, years more to decide what to do with it.
She leaned in, reading it again.
To the one who chose to see, not to shoot. You gave us a way home, even if we never reached it. The sea remembers you.
Isla smiled faintly.
No fanfare, no applause, just the echo of kindness, the fragile, stubborn kind that refuses to die.
She touched the glass, whispered something only the sea might hear, then turned and walked slowly out into the rain.
And far below the cliffs, in waters deep and quiet, something stirred and was still again. The end.